before last Friday, we were talking about the human chakra system. I brought this little dealie from our office here. These are things that you'll see up all over the place. This kind of little secret hanging out in plain view that some of the great minds in Asia and the Buddhists and the Hindus and stuff have come to conclude is operative. So I just, what I want to do is I want to move back into that general area to talk tonight about the, I've touched upon before this issue of the octave of worldviews. And it's usually come up in the context of one of the other subjects that we were talking about. And you'll recall I talked to you about how I had personally gotten into this major conflict with F. Lee Bailey and had ended up talking to Professor John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard, and ultimately him recommending that I come back to a PhD thesis, comparing and contrasting the utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning with the intuitionist mode of ethical reasoning. And it was in that context that I ran into this ultimate secret that I wanted to share with you. And I've run to the board a couple times and very quickly kind of sketched out what it is that we're talking about here, about what it is that they said was happening. And what I want to do today is I want to be able to kind of focus on it, since you're going to get to go home for a Thanksgiving, and we'll probably want to have something to talk with your folks about over turkey. And so you can get out a chart and we can show them this, right? So what I want to do today is, you remember, I had talked about the fact that Potter was asserting, Dr. Ralph Potter was asserting that number one, that there was this discovery that had been made by his mentor, Dr. Talcott Parsons, that when it comes to discussing any particular public policy issue, that our human family, that Talcott Parsons had come to determine through a long process of inductive research, that he believed that our human family would ultimately divide ourselves into these, in his opinion, 5 basic different groups that were predicated upon their different worldviews, and that he identified them in his writings just simply as right systematists and left systematists, and then right marginalists and left marginalists, and then, to no one's surprise, middle marginalists. Okay, and he talked about the fact that these groupings or worldviews would manifest themselves in the context of any public policy debate. Whether you wanted to debate whether or not a given nation state should utilize first strike nuclear weapons, whether you wanted to discuss the issue of whether or not a state had the authority to ban abortions, whether or not a state had a right to engage in capital punishment, whatever the public policy issue was that you were discussing, he postulated that our human family in a given community would in fact divide itself up into these 5 different camps. And each of them would advocate a different way to address and solve that particular public policy problem. And Dr. Ralph Potter, as you recall, I told you that Ralph Potter sort of was attempting to address the question, studying with Talcott Parsons, as to what is it that made a person fall into one or another of these categories. What would cause them to adhere to one or another of these particular worldviews as distinct from another? And Ralph Potter ended up designing what came to be known rather famously as Potter's box. And that in this box they set forth the 4 pillar beliefs on the basis of which a person will come to adhere to one or another of these particular worldviews. And as I pointed out, well, Ralph Potter, has put various things into these boxes at different times during his research periods. When I finally pushed him into a corner and jumped up and down on him as one of his PhD students, I said, well, tell me what the answer to this is. And of course, he was very leery about saying there's an answer to this, but he said, look, if I had to come right down to it, it's one of those things when someone says, well, if you really want to know the truth, you say, well, yes, that's why I ask you, And so what he ended up saying is that the basic beliefs were cosmology, teleology, ontology, and epistemology. Now these are all just big fat words for some really fundamentally basic truth or reality pertaining to ultimate reality. Cosmology being the fundamental factual question as to how the universe came into being. How did all of this get here? And the teleological question is, where is it all going? Is the universe unfolding in any type of organic process that is pointing towards some particular ultimate point that can therefore give the process that's going on some ultimate meaning or purpose, at least a relative purpose as to its ultimate end or objective? And the third basic pillar question was the ontological question. And that is, in the midst of the cosmology coming into being and the teleology unfolding, how did consciousness come into being? And what's this nature of consciousness? Is it some kind of an epiphenomenon of the interaction between mass and energy? Is it something that pre-existed matter? Is it something that operates distinct from physical matter? How did it come into being, and what's the nature of it? And then the fourth and final of the pillar questions was the epistemological question. And that is, what means do we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can possibly gather the data together to ascertain the answers to big cosmic questions like this? And it reduces itself operationally, and that's one of the advantages I had in sort of being a lawyer, is as you remember that Khalil Gibran talked about the lawyer in the Prophet, that the lawyers are the ones that always want to chisel reality into stone. And so what I would do is I just got down to him, I said, look, at epistemologically, what does that mean, basically? And he says, well, it really has to do with whether or not one believes that as a human being we're confined to simply the data that we can discern through our five senses that have come to be identified by the consensus as belonging to us as human beings. That is our hearing and seeing and touching and smelling and tasting, that these particular types of directly experiential experiences that we have that download data into our brain that enables us to then apply our intellect to this data to try to sort it out and categorize it and decide whether or not we can work out and discern some kind of algorithm functioning within the pattern that enables us to project it out to predict other things that are going to be happening. So that these four pillar questions are what Dr. Ralph Potter ultimately told me were the pillar questions that had to be answered by every human being. And if in fact, and you remember me talking about this, if in fact a person provides an answer to each of these four pillar questions, each of which is internally and self-referentially consistent with each of the other three answers that they've provided, what it does is it generates a particular common principle, a certain principle that all of the answers generate sort of inductively. And if you take this principle and you apply it consistently in response to the kind of normal everyday challenges or questions that occur to you during the course of your life, what that will do is it will generate a philosophy. And what it'll do is it'll generate a consistent philosophy, one that one can make very general statements about. And as I told you, the classic joke in the realm of philosophy is that all of philosophy is simply attempting to ascertain the epistemological answer to the ontological question. And so you can always write that in your book and keep it, so that any time that you're into philosophy or anything like that, you can understand. If you really want to get down to it, that's what they say you're engaged in doing, trying to figure out epistemologically how it is that we can gather data. You've read all the kind of stuff about, am I really here, or do I really exist, or does anything really exist? Is everything just a bunch of moving, atoms and stuff? Do we exist because we think? All of those questions that people try to address in philosophy are basically an attempt to ascertain the epistemological answer to the ontological question of being in consciousness. Now, all of this is. Do I have a wiper outer here? That all of this is introductory to the basic question. This is not going to be good. Do we have something that can actually?
Pretty similar to that one. So.
Bold color, dry erase. Okay, not erasing very well. Okay, but just if you can give me just kind of a wet cloth or something to get that out of there, I would appreciate that. Thank you, Chris. So the bottom line is that all of this is just an introduction to what I want to talk about. What I had done is, in doing the master's work that I was doing there under them, I developed in my original master's thesis the operating thesis that there were in fact two additional worldviews that were fully legitimate, integrated worldviews that were not really being addressed by Talcott Parsons, and that these were the classic conservative worldview and the liberal worldview, which of course are a big favorite subject at Harvard University. I'd love to talk about these. But what we realized is that this set actually reflects the right systematists are actually kind of authoritarians, and the right marginalists that he identified were reactionaries, which unfortunately we've had a lot more experience with in the last few years than we had hoped we were going to have. But there's this whole reactionary worldview who are the right marginalists. Then there are the right middle marginalists who are the conservatives. Then the middle marginalists that are the moderates in any kind of political discourse. And then the left middle marginalists are the liberals. And then your left marginalists are progressives. And then your left systematists are what they call utopianists. Okay? And they tend to be theological. These people are theological people for the most part. Okay? So do we have something to wash this with, or they're going to get it? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Patty. Okay. Okay. This is not good. Okay. There we go. That's good enough to get it out of the way. So that way at least you're not distracted by all of that. Okay. So you have to go through dress rehearsals all the time before you do these things, right? So in any event, what I wanted to do today is I want to talk about these particular worldviews and get to understand how it is they function. And maybe we'll get to talking about some classic people who represent these particular worldviews to make it more concrete. I remember I was always distressed throughout all of my kind of formal education that these professors would get up in front of us and kind of pontificate and kind of bloviate about what their particular position was on everything, and would expect you to make sense out of it. And I'm trying to make sure that it's concrete and real to you, so that you'll know the difference in people. Like, for example, I've given you some examples of the authoritarians, The authoritarians are people that would be like the major warlords that you're hearing a lot about, that are over in the Middle East, that are in Afghanistan. In other places, there are these warlords that kind of assert dominion over various physical areas, and that they make war on any of their competitors, and they assert kind of authoritarian dominion over all their people. And the classic examples that exist in history are Genghis Khan and others like that. The reactionaries are those who are a lot of people confuse them with authoritarians. But in fact, an authoritarian, and I want to talk about this, is that, as I pointed out before, authoritarians have a cosmological worldview. Their cosmology is one in which they believe that the entire physical universe is expanding and disintegrating into nothingness, that I remember I told you about. And because of that, they do not believe that there is any kind of ultimate referent in accordance with which one can say anything is particularly right or wrong, because the whole world is basically just chaos and disintegrating into nothingness. And so that therefore, the only thing that can lend order to an otherwise chaotic world is a strong, domineering kind of individual personality who can impose his view on everyone else.
So for the warlord, can we just say there's no higher authority? That the authoritarian thinks they are the highest authority?
No. I don't think that's the, because what they believe is that there is no such thing as authority other than raw brute force, and that they'll believe that they can impose it by brute force, and if someone else can dethrone them, then they become in charge. But it isn't just because they don't recognize at the moment anybody being superior to them, it's that they genuinely don't believe there's any such thing, that all there is the brute force, the power comes out of the end of a gun or at the end of a sword.
So could you be authoritarian and not be an authority? Like, could you be like
Oh yes, there are all kinds of people with authoritarian worldviews and authoritarian dispositions that they aren't necessarily in authority. They try to be. They will compete. They'll compete and fight, and it's the dog-eat-dog world. That there is no order to the world except the dominating of the superior of the species, and that's how they manifest themselves. But there's a lot of competitors around for that position that have an authoritarian worldview.
Do you think that the U.S. is authoritarian?
Well, no. That there's. I mean, we get carried away and kind of simplistically assert that periodically, but the fact of the matter is that there are people in government circles that will come into power, and they will advise the government that they ought to do certain kinds of things. For example, like they ought to assert full spectrum dominance and assert complete hegemony over the entire world, and garner unto ourselves all the resources of the world that we want to have. And that what you find out is that those kind of people are the kind of people that we used to refer to as the robber barons. Those huge magnates that end up becoming monopolistic owners of railways, like E.H. Harriman, the people like Carnegie, the people like John D. Rockefeller. There are these individuals that rise to the very major position of power, and they assert their power and dominion over more and more. They aren't satisfied with simply monopolizing one whole particular part of an industry. They decide they want to go for horizontal and vertical monopoly over not only their particular product, but all the other services that serve them. And they will expand constantly into taking more and more control. And they want to have authority over everything. Now, there are elements inside United States advisory groups who are like that. And sometimes they try to disguise themselves as mere reactionaries. They're attempting to rationalize what they're doing by pretending that there's some major threat. there's some ultimate other that's really threatening us. But it really is all a rationale for attempting to assert authoritarian dominion over the world. Now, usually they don't rise to a position of gaining unchecked control in the United States, though they periodically rise to a position like that. You can see probably Dick Cheney is a kind of guy like that. That he will say things like, people are whimpering about us waterboarding some guy 126 times or something, and what would you prefer, that we stand on principle, or that we do what's necessary to stay in control? And so which means is they have no ethics at all other than being in power and dominion, and that they'll do anything that's necessary to stay there. And so, and especially because they don't discern any type of referent in relationship to which what they're doing is wrong, because that their assertion of dominion they rationalize by providing some type of order to an otherwise chaotic universe that has no meaning, no purpose, no reference for right and wrong except their power and dominion. And so it's a very primitive worldview rooted in the cosmological assumptions of ultimate entropy, that everything is disintegrating and falling apart. And but for the assertion of their power and will and dominion, that the world will be chaos. And so in that sense, they rationalize it as being legitimate, what they're doing. And there are actually some instances of individuals who in this authoritarian worldview actually rise to be authoritative leaders, and that they're not authoritarian in the fact that they're only pursuing their own immediate short-term power and in self-satisfaction, but that they actually are asserting kind of an authoritative power over an entire area of the world or people, but they are actually doing it for what they understand to be the better interests of the people. So there's, as I've pointed out to you, there's a higher and a lower manifestation of each of these worldviews. So there are the authoritarians in the lower manifestation of this worldview, and authoritative leaders in the higher manifestation of this worldview. And you can meet some fairly benign types like this, like Abu Dai. Abu Dai was a major chieftain of one of the Arab tribes prior to World War I. That he was the guy that allied with T.E. Lawrence to raise the Arab tribes to come together to throw the Turks out of their Holy Land. But he was the guy that I told you about, the one that said, I'm Abu Dai, I bear 23 great wounds, and I am a river to my people. I mean, really quite an extraordinary, charismatic person, and quite selfless, actually. But he was an authoritative leader. But the authoritarian leaders tend to be seeking their own power, their own self-satisfaction. They're constantly using their authority to maximize the kind of short-term personal gratification that they get. They tend to be fairly lecherous and materially indulgent. For the most part, you can see characteristics of them because they believe that the actual mode of ethical reasoning that is derived from their answering these particular questions this way, the particular mode of ethical reasoning is when faced with a series of options, they will select that one that generates the greatest degree of personal, immediate gratification to themselves, personally, in that they're constantly attempting to aggrandize unto themselves more power, more money, more material goods. They're constantly attempting to fill this hole sort of at the center of their being with an attempt to increase what they see as a source of security for themselves, but that they're insatiable in that regard. Then you have the reactionaries that have a different cosmological worldview, I pointed out. That is that rather than believing that the universe was all disintegrating expanding and disintegrating into nothingness. They actually believe that at the point in time at which the universe expands and disintegrates all out into a point where every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe, which at the present time we believe to be like an inchoate quantum field, is separate and apart from every other one, that at that particular point, the impetus that was imposed upon them by the initial Big Bang will expire, and that there'll be a moment of stasis, and at that point, the bonding phenomenon that every single integer of matter in the universe has for every other one, that one I mentioned that we learned about in high school physics, that the degree of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, but it's still extant, and that at that point, that when the impetus imposed upon them by the Big Bang is expired, they will start to attract, they'll continue to attract each other, and unresisted by an expanding force, they will start to contract. They will start to come back into contact with each other. And the inchoate quantum inchoate quantum fields will form like muons and then work their way in neutrinos. They have all kinds of subdivisions of the material realm that we have been engaged in, usually through artificial means of colliders, breaking these elements down into smaller and smaller particles. But so far, we believe that the smallest that we've been able to discern, at least, is this inchoate quantum field that manifests itself first as a wave of energy and then or as a particle of mass, but in a completely unpredictable pattern, but that it actually blanks out of discernible existence for brief milliseconds, and then flashes back into material manifestation, either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass. But that this seems to be the smallest entity of matter in the universe. And that matter, as we know, is made up of either mass or energy, which is just a kind of an arbitrary distinction that is made between a certain density of these inchoate quantum fields. That if there's a certain number of them that are compacted together into a small enough space, they become an actual unit of energy, and that an electron volt unit. And if in fact you compress a number of those together in a tight enough space, they become an atomic mass unit. So that this way that we have of perceiving material reality is in a certain sense a projection out onto them of a certain set of concepts that we have. And that if in fact they're engaged in the process of discerning actual operative natural laws, then they become much more helpful, these concepts, okay? So that the distinctions that they make between a particle of mass, for example, and a unit of energy is meaningful in the sense that they tend to function in ways that are categorically different. In the same way that they look out upon the kind of evolution of life on our planet, and they characterize various species and phylums and subphylums, and they usually do so on the basis of certain functional details of these different manifestations of life. And if they're adequately inductive in their process, then those categories are meaningful and helpful. And so there seems to have been a consensus on the part of our human family that this perception of the material universe in terms of this bifurcation between mass and energy is a meaningful one functionally. But the point is that the reactionaries believe that when the universe gets to its full state of expansion and starts to collapse, it'll start to collapse down in upon itself again, and will start to reconfigure these subparticles will start to come together until they eventually make a proton or a neutron and an electron, and then they come back together and form an actual atom of an element, and the elements then form compounds and then mixtures and then planets and star systems and galaxies. And that what the reactionaries are postulating is that there is this oscillation that is going on. That's the teleological assumption of this particular worldview. And so that the cosmological question is that the cosmos has always been here. That the cosmos didn't necessarily pop into being de novo with a particular Big Bang. In fact, each Big Bang is just the beginning of the next cycle, or periodos, as they call it, or the next magnum annus, the grand year of the expansion and contraction. It's a particular cycle that our physical universe goes through. And during each of those cycles, each half of the cycle, there comes a particular point, either during the expansion, out from every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter being in direct physical contact with every other one, constituting the size of the head of a pin, that after the Big Bang is initiated, there comes a point during the expansion and disintegration when the particular confluence in mass and energy, the ratio that obtains at that time, actually generates life. And that life is an organic function of the oscillation of the cosmos, and that it occurs during a certain span of time during the expansion. And then when it disintegrates into all of these smaller particles, there is no, at least there'd be no human life and no kind of sentient life that is observable. But there'll come a point in time when it stops and starts to come back together again, according to the reactionary worldview, their cosmology. And once again, there will be a particular ratio of mass and energy that ends up generating life and consciousness again. And there will eventually become a point where it is so densely packed that no such observable sentient life seems to exist anymore, at least nothing that we would be able to discern, because human life can't survive at that stage. So you'll see that there is a categorical difference between the cosmological beliefs and the teleological beliefs of the authoritarians and the reactionaries. And that the reactionaries, therefore, their mode of ethical reasoning, unlike the authoritarians, who believe that the world is otherwise just chaotic, and unless one powerful individual person, through an act of his will, and almost always his will, asserts their dominion over the community, that there will be no order, there will be no chaos, there will be only chaos. And so that mode of ethical reasoning that they pursue, of pursuing their own self-interest, is their mode of ethical reasoning, and they rationalize it through their cosmology and teleology. But the reactionaries, unlike that, they don't believe that it's just chaos. They believe that there is an ability on the part of our human family to ultimately discern the fact that there is this major oscillation going on in the universe, and that they therefore divide all their reality into two, and they have a dialectical binary perception of reality itself, and that everything that's taking place, the basic function that's going on in the universe, is a binary relationship between light and darkness, good and bad, yin and yang, mass and energy. That they perceive everything in terms of this overall oscillation between these two different stages of the universe. And therefore, they derive from that particular discernment of this ongoing binary dynamic, they discern a mode of ethical reasoning which lends meaning to their life, because they believe that you can get on one side or another of a process, and it lends meaning, because everything ultimately is a competition between A and B. And so that in this lower manifestation, you get this straight up material dialectic that goes on between forces of good and bad, and darkness and light. And that I mentioned to you before, when we touched upon it more briefly, is that you get this peculiar process, like Margaret Mead recognized with the Aboriginal tribe on the valley floor down in New Guinea, that she actually recognized the fact that they were unconsciously dividing themselves into half, and then engaging in that kind of a combat where they would lose one member, and then they would retreat to the hillsides of the valley and engage in a huge dirge and this celebration of pathos and sorrow over the loss of their member. And the other side would in fact engage in this huge celebration and in this gala event with intoxicating beverages and sexual orgies and celebrating the fruitfulness of life. And that she actually recognized that they were taking turns doing this to lend meaning to their otherwise boring life living on the valley floor of this primitive valley. And so that we have all kinds of manifestations of that, as I pointed out, this peculiar process that goes on here, for example, in the United States, of baseball teams, local cities having baseball teams and football teams and soccer teams and basketball teams, and they all dress up in different colors, and they all throw a ball out onto the field and fight over it in one form or another, and push it to one side of the end of the field or another and try to put it into a goal, and that people go crazy over this. They get into the stands and paint themselves up with different kind of tribal colors and scream and holler and get intoxicated, both literally and figuratively. And so that this reactionary force, which I've talked about before, which is a quality and characteristic of the second chakra as well, is the characteristic of the reactionary worldview. And that it's rooted in a deep and abiding cosmology and a specific teleological assumption about the unfolding nature of the universe. And so that people who are reactionaries, they in fact harbor a deep and unconscious conviction that there is some ultimate other who are threatening us, whoever the us is. And the fact is, when you get those people dominating in two different cultures, they tend to distrust the other culture. They tend to project out onto that other culture this quality of the ultimate other that is threatening them, and that they therefore make war against each other by consent, just like the two tribes in New Guinea. And so that you get these ancient stories of these warrior cultures like the Spartans. And you get these heroic stories of like Dionysius in the 300, the famous Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 of these people stood off the Persian army of like 20 skrillion, and this lives in history as this extraordinary feat on the part of people who had this intense dialectical perception. And that the Persians in that particular event were coming in to try to assert power and dominion over them. No rationale that the Spartans had done anything wrong, that they had threatened them in any way, but the authoritarians were simply trying to expand their power and dominion, and the reactionaries viewed them as the ultimate other, and that they had this consensual combat, and that this goes on all the time. And so what happens is authoritarians who want to assert power and control over a given culture, oftentimes, as I say, disguise themselves as reactionaries, and they end up generating a false enemy. That's in the story that I told you about George H.W. Bush, when he first started getting information back in 1990 from the CIA indicating that the Soviet Union might be going to voluntarily dissolve itself in the next year or two, that he rushed right straight out and set up this other thing with Saddam Hussein and lured him into going down into Kuwait, and then got up and said, we're going to have to protect Saudi Arabia, and they lied to Saudi Arabia through Dick Cheney, and got them to invite them in, and went in and invaded the Holy Land and occupied the oil fields, which they, as authoritarians, wanted to occupy and assert dominion over. But in some sense, there were reactionaries in the coalition. They were saying we have to keep China from getting access to that oil. And so that they saw themselves in the long term having this dialectical struggle with the Chinese, And so they wanted to secure the oil fields for themselves. So what they did is they ended up characterizing the local Saddam Hussein as this ultimate other who was actually going to bomb us with a nuclear bomb. You know, that Condoleezza Rice and saying, oh, we can't wait to go, we have to go get them and knock them out because otherwise there'll be a mushroom cloud over New York City. You know, these two worldviews are extremely powerful. As I pointed out, the root chakra of the first paradigm worldview and the second chakra of this dialectical worldview are extremely powerful, and they generate very powerful energy up into the body. And the fact is, these people can become captive of that energy in their body, in their physiology, and that they perceive the whole world through the prism of this very intense energy field that surrounds their body, generated from one or the other of these two chakras, and it prisms the reality that they perceive. And that if you get very charismatic and strong people having this worldview, they tend to be able to impose it upon other people because they stimulate fear. They stimulate fear in people. And this whole first chakra fight or flight energy is quite spontaneous. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day that they were talking about a person who was studying martial arts, that it took him 6 full years so that when somebody threw a punch out like that, that they wouldn't automatically go like that. They're just absolutely automatic. And they have to spend years training themselves out of that, lifting that energy up out of that first chakra where you have this million-year trained instinct to recoil into fight or flight. And so that this thing is deep inside of all of us. And every one of these chakras is in us. And the thesis that I'm maintaining in this course is that it's important for us to understand that every single one of these energies that are in us, in our chakra system, is important to our human family. It's just that you can't let any one of these dominate and become in control to the exclusion of everything else, because there are downsides of each of these. But it's important for me to emphasize that there are upsides of all of them. Okay? So now the conservative worldview, is the one that we normally have historically associated with the Republican Party, that they're just normal conservatives, and that their worldview is distinct from these other two in that whereas the authoritarians don't discern any type of pattern in the universe that can be used as a referent for normative valuing, and therefore they have to superimpose an artificial order through the power of their will and dominion over an area. And the reactionaries can discern only this ultimate dialectical dynamic going on in the universe of the cycling of the universe, expanding and contracting. The conservatives, they believe that in fact, and the reactionaries believe that you can only get on one side or another of this dialectic because it's driven by cosmic forces. But the conservatives actually, for the first time, they believe that there is a factor of the human mind in the intellect that has been developed by our human family over the millions of years, that we can look out upon this universe that is perceived by the adherents to the first paradigm worldview and the second paradigm worldview. They can look out upon this, and they can through the power of mind, they can actually perceive not only the dialectic that's going on that is discernible by the reactionaries, but they can in fact they can track back with their intellect down in through the data of how the universe is working in myriad ways, and then they can arithmetically, they can figure out the algorithms of the functions that are occurring, and then they can turn and project those formulas into the future. And they can project out alternative futures, that they're not locked into a rigid dialectic that is predetermined, so that you only have an option of getting on one side or another of it. They actually believe that they can project out through the power of mind, they can project out a series of alternative realities that can manifest, and that they can choose one by an act of will, they can actually choose one of these options, and they can conduct themselves in a manner just as though it were true. But they know that it's not. It's just something that is a possibility out in the future. And what they do is through an act of will, they can select out. Now this is not through some sort of intuitive or numinous phenomenon. It's a function of simple intellect and rational analysis. And what they do is they project out these other possibilities, and what they do is they seize upon one of them and they comport their conduct with it, and then they attempt to, through existential assertions of power and will, they bring that one into being. So that the power of mind enters in here into the third worldview, and the conservatives therefore believe that they can, by discerning the patterns of the past, they can project out into the future how to maintain the same patterns. And so they have this attachment to what it is they've been able to discern about the past, the order that they've discerned in the past, and if they can keep it stable by making choices that retain this kind of this structure to the universe, they can depend upon it, they can rely upon it, they feel secure, and that they can keep change from happening that is adverse to their interests. And so you have this worldview that is more empowered in a certain sense from the reactionaries, who feel more helpless and that they have no choice other than to get on one side or another of a dialectic, and the others of the authoritarians who have no option but to have some strong authority figure end up governing. This is one where there's a much more active role played by the human mind and the intellect in the assertion of will and power on the part of a community, and they tend to have a social form of a nation state. They form a major nation state as their basic social form. The reactionaries tend to be tribal, okay, and the conservatives tend toward the nation state. Okay, now when we come to the moderates here, in the middle of this spectrum, the most important thing about the moderates is their epistemological assumption. Their epistemological assumption is that we have only the five senses by means of which we can discern reality, in that they share the epistemological assumptions here. But they also do not, in fact, go to the point of making an existential choice like the conservatives do, of attaching themselves to a particular selected future and conducting themselves as though it's real already. What they do is they hold their judgments in abeyance. And they say, look, until such time as we can actually measure something, weigh something, we can gather the data through our five senses, process it through our intellect, and determine that it's true in some static way. We cannot make choices predicated upon that. All we can do is develop a thesis. So that they end up being largely agnostic about a lot of these major cosmic questions. Because as you know, the scientific community, the scientific logical positivists and the materialists in the scientific community are questing like mad to figure out, what happened just microseconds after the Big Bang. They're engaged in putting up all the space telescopes and everything, trying to figure out exactly what's happening. And so that they're holding in abeyance any kind of ultimate conclusion, even to the point where they, up until a matter of a few years ago, they were refusing to acknowledge that there were any other planets in the entire universe. Really. I mean, it sounds like you're in the Dark Ages somewhere. But the fact is, they were saying, look, we cannot assert that there are any other planets in the entire universe because we haven't seen them and we haven't measured them. So we don't know that they're there. Now, fortunately, in the period of the last 10 years, there's been a very major process going on by means of which, having put up the space telescopes, they're able to discern these planets around a number of the stars. And so now they're actually shifting over into at least acknowledging that other planets exist. And so now they've actually discovered planets that are solid planets made up of minerals and solid matter, so that they believe that there are any number of other planets that are similar to the Earth. And so you're starting to get a lot of these major treatises being written about searching for another Earth. And so that the scientific logical positivists, the moderates, are forever expanding the amount of knowledge they have, and they're being willing to make assertions that are expanding, but they will not take any position on a lot of these ultimate questions. Now, there are members of the scientific community that tend to be kind of conservative, and that they'll just hang right on, and they'll deny that these other things are true until they're absolutely compelled, kicking and screaming, by the evidence to acknowledge that something is true. They'd gotten into the habit of refusing to acknowledge that it was true, so that even in the face of the evidence that it's true, they won't say it's true. So you get some kind of conservative influences here in the scientific community, and so you get people like Thomas Kuhn wrote the major treatise on how scientific change takes place, and he actually asserted something that's very important for us here. He actually said that for the most part, scientists don't actually ever change their mind about what they have figured out to be true. It's just that they die off, and that the younger people who have developed another alternative thesis about what's true eventually come into the positions of being in authority, and then the scientific community acknowledges that something has been established. So that this is a method of the moderates, that they are very careful. They're not conservative in the sense that they're hanging on to past things overly. That's an influence of the conservatives in their community. But in the moderate community, they're willing to change. They're willing to amend their thesis. They're willing to expand their beliefs, but it proceeds very moderately. And so that in the political realm, and we'll talk about that next time we're together. Let me see that we'll talk about some specific examples of these people in the concrete world. We'll come down from this kind of reality 101, some more politics 500, to talk about Dick Cheney, and we'll talk about Richard Gebhardt and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and other potential candidates, so that you can see where they fall along this particular political spectrum. But now I handed out, or that we handed out to you through the internet in week 2, an actual, I think it was a 70-page essay that I wrote about the discussion that went on among the reactionaries, the conservatives, the moderates, and the liberals at the end of the Cold War. That they actually began having this kind of exchange of papers and discourses about which one of these worldviews ought to be adopted by Western civilization once the Soviet Union had dissolved, and that it had been introduced back in 1989, this conversation, and that they'd started having this conversation. So you might take a look at that again, or for the first time, and take a look at it, and you'll see that some of the concrete discussions of these adherence to these particular worldviews and how practical that was right at the end of right at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But the liberal worldview is an important one here now, because this liberal worldview is the first of the worldviews in which there is an actual recognition of the fact that there may be another faculty functioning in the human being, that there's another faculty by means of which we may be able to discern a unitive phenomenon in the universe, this thing that Crane Brinton talked about, that we touched on in the very first class, that liberals, they have a different mode of ethical reasoning. The moderates, in light of the fact that they will not take a position on matters of ultimate reality that they don't have definitive answers for. They go about a mode of ethical reasoning, which is whenever they're confronted by a series of alternative choices in the public policy realm, they will select that one that generates the greatest good for the greatest number. Did I get some water? Did I have? Yeah, okay, just let me get. They will simply pragmatically select that option that generates the greatest good for the greatest number. It's virtually It's virtually mathematical. They will basically figure out all the pluses and minuses of a particular policy choice, decide which one of them generates the greatest good for the greatest number of people in their community, and they'll select that rather woodenly. But because they're unable to take definitive positions on some of the ultimate cosmic questions that would give them a sense of a more absolute confidence in what type of decisions to make. So there's a lot of people that think this is the safest place to be. Because while you may have to forego some of the benefits of making a choice about ultimate reality that are in fact correct, and therefore get to do some things that are unexpected and very helpful for your community, the fact is, if people are making intuitive discernments about ultimate reality and they're going forward and acting upon it and they're incorrect, you can have some damage that's caused to the community. So you get a lot of these people saying that being moderate about something is a lot safer because you don't run the risk of major mistakes. But on the other hand, you miss out on an awful lot of opportunities that you might otherwise have. But the liberals, what happens is, rather than making a strictly majoritarian, utilitarian judgment when confronted with a series of public policy options, what the liberals do is they say, when faced, they begin for the first time to supplement the data that the middle moderates have, the moderates have here. They begin to supplement that data with intuition. And they begin to utilize intuition as an ancillary or supplemental factor in their mode of ethical reasoning. Rather than pursuing a simple utilitarian, majoritarian decision, they will in fact choose the option that generates the greatest good for the greatest number, but which at the same time does at least something for the least well-off. And in fact, this is the liberal ethic has actually been developed to the point where John Rawls, the fellow I'd mentioned to you that wrote A Theory of Justice, has actually worked out a formula for the liberal mode of ethical reasoning, in which he recommends that the collective assert ourselves to stimulate production on the part of the entrepreneurial class, but to take from them through taxes a certain percentage of their profits and redistribute them, starting with the least well-off, to give them subsistence, and then move on up through the system to try to equalize the resources that people have access to. But there'll come a point in time where if you take just a little bit more away from the entrepreneurial class, they'll cut back on what they're producing. And then you'll have less total goods, and you won't have as much as you would have had to distribute to the least well-off and the others. So Rawls has worked out in his Theory of Justice that was published back in 1971 that he has set forth his Theory of Justice, setting forth this formula for the liberals to use to govern their mode of ethical reasoning. Brzezinski, in the work that I cited to you in the essay that you had, Brzezinski, in a book that he published in 1992, a little monograph that was called The Threat of Chaos on the Eve of the 21st Century, The Threat of Global Chaos on the Eve of the 21st Century, he proposed that the mode of ethical reasoning that should be followed by the leaders of Western civilization is they should have he said that the true motivating objective of Western civilization was the pursuit of permissive cornucopia. That we were actually driven by a materialist desire to have as much material goods as we could. He recommended that what we do is we temper that particular self-serving majoritarian mode of ethical reasoning by adopting a premise that what we would do is that we would adopt a series of ethical standards that were ultimately moral in their nature, without making any reference to what that was, but he said that he wanted to have identified a series of ethical principles that were essentially moral in their nature, and to have the leaders of government and business voluntarily comport their conduct in accordance with those. And that would in fact give them a better chance here at the end of the Cold War of being able to sell their worldview, their democratic liberal worldview, to the rest of the people of the world in the power vacuum that was created by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, you should take a look at that book. Put it up on your famous bookshelf that you're building here in this course. But it's called The Threat of Global Chaos on the Eve of the 21st Century. And you go through it with a careful reading of that, a critical reading of that book, and you'll see that on a first reading, it sounds really good. And you go, wow, this seems like a nice liberal way of going at things. But when you read a little bit harder, you're saying, wait a second, all he's calling for is a voluntary compliance on their part with these ethical standards. And he hasn't really defined how you go about identifying a moral principle. Okay? And what you see also is he always introduces those paragraphs in saying, if in fact the United States is going to continue to be the leader of the world, then we should do all of this stuff. And so you can see that the entire development of this liberal mode of ethical reasoning is predicated both on an acceptance of the transnational corporate capitalist economic system for the development of natural resources and the distribution in consumption of natural resources. It doesn't question the capitalist model as the sole and governing economic system. But what it does is it suggests that the captains of industry and the leaders of the political parties voluntarily comport their conduct in accordance with a set of these ethical principles that are essentially moral in their nature. And that way it will give us a better opportunity to maintain control over the world. And that's what he says, and that's the liberal ethic. The progressives now, for the first time, we come over here, and the progressives have shifted to having this particular experience, this unitive experience, this intuitive experience that we're talking about, that Crane Brinton is talking about. They acknowledge that it's valid, like the liberals do, but the liberals, as I said, only use it as an ancillary or supplemental factor in conditioning their otherwise utilitarian, majoritarian type of decisions. But the progressives, in fact, make it central, so that the utilitarian mode of ethical analysis, the democratic system of choosing how to distribute things in a way that the majority wants and is satisfied with, is not only supplemented by this other more generous ethical principle, but in fact it becomes co-equal to it. So that there is a direct joining together of the mode of ethical reasoning of majoritarian utilitarianism and this ethos of distributive justice, of providing to everyone the basics of what they need, not in accordance with what they're able to contribute to the system, but based upon the human recognition that people, children, and other people are in need of basic resources, and that this is a matter of justice, not a matter of charity. And so the progressives shift over, and this particular issue, what we're noticing here is there is an ascending experience of this unitive experience, this thing that Crane Brinton talks about, the ability to experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe into one harmonious whole. And by means of the experience that you have, like seeing or hearing, by means of that experience, you can tell intuitively and experientially what type of human conduct, both individual or collective, in fact comports with the natural order of the universe. And that this particular experience becomes more and more prevalent as you work your way to the left in this political spectrum. And I hasten again to point out that the reactionaries are made up not only of fascists and state corporate capitalists, but also of state communists. That in fact the communists derive their entire sense of well-being from their confrontation with the capitalist class. So the two of them are in constant dialectical confrontation, in that they are both reactionaries. And that's why it was fairly natural that the system, unfortunately, in the Soviet Union gravitated to Stalinism, in this kind of state centralism, in authoritarian overtones. But it became very abusive and restrictive, and that many people held on to the ideal of communitarianism, which tends to rise more and more as you come to the left of the spectrum. You get a higher and higher sense of communitarianism, but not collectivism, that is girding its loins to fight and confront the capitalist class militarily out of the base of a nation state, as occurred in Russia. Okay? And so what happens here is the progressives now, for the first time, make this mode of ethical reasoning, this intuitive mode of ethical reasoning, co-equal with the application of a strictly rational, linear, utilitarian, majoritarian judgment. And so the mode of ethical reasoning here is one that's balanced between the two. And then you get to the utopianists, and the utopianists, as you recall, I touched upon it, the utopianists have a cosmology which is predicated upon the assumption that the entire physical universe was actually enfolded into being out of an infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness. And that these ultimately irreducible integers of matter, these inchoate quantum fields, are simply nodules of individuated consciousness. And that therefore the entire physical universe is shot through with consciousness. And in fact, it abides in an infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness. And that they actually believe that by resort to this experience as your dominant and primary mode of ethical reasoning, you can actually make choices on behalf of the common weal that are beneficial for the entire survival of the species, not only of our species, but of all of the species, and of all of the environment, and all of the planet, and all of the universe, and other beings on other planetary systems. And so that it is a much more expansive view, and it has a mode of ethical reasoning which is virtually literally selfless, because one has, in a sense, transcended the artificial bounds of one's own separate self. And that while it doesn't mean that you fall down in a big lump and can't get up, what it means is that you can actually perambulate in a state of consciousness where you recognize the unity of all being, and that you can recognize the harmony that abides in the universe, and that you can make decisions that are predicated upon the well-being of others equal to your own self. And it's the highest form of exercising this particular faculty that Dr. Crane Brinton talked about. And so you see in that these particular worldviews are in fact historically represented by the same colors that you see in the classic chakras. This one's yellow. You can never see it whenever you put it up on the board. But they go red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And so that it's and what I'm proposing is that in an ideal world that we would be able to, and this is what I'm proposing that you might consider proposing as you go out into the world, is actually having 7 full political parties that actually espouse a particular set of public policy solutions that are predicated upon their assumptions as to the answers of these 4 basic pillar questions. And that what you do is that there's no way of telling at any given point right now what percentage of the population at any given time adheres to any one or another of these worldviews. But one of the things that it would do is it would establish the need for coalitions to be established in the legislative bodies among people who are not just, putting their finger in the wind and trying to figure out what they should do to stay elected, or doing what it is whoever pays for their campaigns, but that they actually have a full-scale worldview and a set of beliefs, and that they can propose coherent and comprehensive programs that will address and solve these problems. And then what they do is they come together and they try to discuss what can be done in a given situation. And what I'm suggesting is that that will also make the federal and state governments much less stable, and therefore less dangerous. That the ability to mount together, to be able for example, to be able to pass the National Defense Authorization Act in the United States, 97% of all the people in the United States completely opposing it, is because the centralized government has been able to get itself formed so that a small elite group can capture it and seize control over it and exercise dominion. And most of those people tend to be these kind of authoritarian type people, like the Koch brothers and others, that reflect these kind of worldviews. And so what I'm suggesting, I just wanted to tip you at this point where we're discussing in more detail the particular predicates of these worldviews, where it is that I'm going to, because I believe that it's a matter of integrity. If in fact a person doesn't know what they believe about these four pillar beliefs, the basic fact is it doesn't make much difference what they think about things. Because usually they either don't work hard enough to ascertain the facts about anything, and even if they do, they don't have anything to compare and contrast it to. They don't have any larger grid to put it into to actually determine what should be done about anything. And so therefore they get pushed around by propaganda. It happens to be whoever told them the last thing that they're basing their beliefs on. So that as a matter of integrity, this would be the best way to have things be, is to have an actual organized political party that is representative of each of these basic organic worldviews that are rooted in these various energy centers of the body, and that therefore a person could get up and explicate their full rationale for why they think that a particular program ought to be propagated to address a particular problem. And if you didn't agree with them, then you can sit down and have a discussion about that. And what I've said is that what I'm being governed by in this regard is, in part, the thing I've mentioned 3 or 4 different times, is that if you take a laser of the color of each of these primary colors, of the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, and you shine those lasers onto a single point, they set up a mutual interference pattern that generates white light. It's a scientific phenomenon. And what I'm suggesting is that the closer these philosophies can come to a clear, rational connection between what it is they think about these major ultimate questions of fact in the universe, and what principles are derivative of a common set of answers to those, and a mode of ethical reasoning that is applied consistently, generating a clear and comprehensive philosophy, and a clearly derivative political philosophy, then you can have a meaningful conversation. You can have them espouse their proposed solutions. They can explain why it is, if their solution is adopted, why it will in fact meet the needs. It'll solve the problem. The point is that it may be predicated upon a different set of values. That they may say, well, the authoritarian could just say, well, look, we can solve this problem here. If we want to build the XL pipeline all the way from Canada down to the Gulf Coast, and the Oglala are sitting on their own land and blocking this pipeline, well, we can just eliminate them. We can just exterminate them. We can get rid of them because there aren't that many of them. And all of us will benefit more by having access to this oil, setting aside the fact they're going to sell it outside of the country. But, that you could, so that they come up with a solution and say, well, gee, that'll work, except, what about the Indians? And they'll say, well, let the Indians vote against it if, the proposition to eliminate them all, but they'll lose because there aren't that many of them. That's a different mode of reasoning, but it's completely consistent with their worldview because there's no ultimate value in their lives because there's nothing to reference it. There's nothing to context it, to give it an absolute value of any kind. Okay? And so we who tend to be toward the left side of the political spectrum would tend to eschew those types of decisions and would try to mobilize our people to vote against them. But we do so by offering a concrete alternative to it. And that's the kind of political system in a democracy that would and should work. And it has the important added benefit of not allowing a major centralized federal government on either a nation-state basis or, more importantly, a global basis to acquire enough power to be able to be captured by a small elite and assert their dominion over the world, which is part of the danger that we're facing in the upcoming crisis in the 21st century, is this gravitating toward a larger and larger national security state under the control of a smaller and smaller percentage of people on the planet, who are at the same time generating the very type of disruptive policies of the global climate change that are causing the disruption, for which they then say they need to have a national security state to quell it and keep it under control. So I'm suggesting that this is a strategic way of addressing this major upcoming crisis, but that it would require the conscious organizing of political parties that advocate these respective worldviews and tender them to the world. So that's the reason that I've spent the time that I have formulating this and doing the research on this and exercising the privilege of getting to come to talk to you about it so that you'll have a model, a template in mind that is completely comprehensive and comprehensible, if not entirely simple, but it's pretty straightforward and rational. And it places great value on the increasing value of the intuitive unitive experience that Dr. Crane Brinton said was in fact the most important single intellectual insight that the greatest minds in our human family had come to based upon all of his research over 50 years. So that's why I'm tendering it to you now, and we'll be discussing this in the context of the course as we go forward and discuss other elements that we want to talk about. Okay? So there it is. I know it wasn't that exciting, but it's a lot of detail, and I think it's very important. And as a member of the baby boom generation, if I were asked to mentor you as my own daughter or son, this is what I would find important to tell you. So that you'd know, at least to work with this as a model to figure out what's wrong with it, what can be improved on it, or whether you agree with it or not, or how you would implement it, because it is a major tactical method of addressing this upcoming crisis in a concrete way. Because as long as the present two-party system stays in power, in effect, they're going to continue to vote the way they do on global warming and global climate change, on militarism and on the national security state, and we're going to be standing here floundering, not quite knowing what to do about this, except to vote for the lesser of two evils, which in the upcoming case will be Hillary Clinton. And then everybody's going to rejoice in having gotten to go out to vote for Hillary Clinton. And she's going to come in and do the same exact kind of things that Barack Obama has been doing. And you just heard this morning that he's signed a secret order now authorizing U.S. military troops in Afghanistan to engage in combat and, in fact, to launch missile strikes against opponents for the Afghan army, to back them up with fighter jets and drones. At the same time, he's telling everybody that he's withdrawing all the military forces, combat troops from Afghanistan. So that you cannot rely upon these people. And we cannot continue to exercise the fiction that if we go out and vote for the better of the two evils, that we're somehow going to be helping to save the world. Because we are actively affirming and authorizing those very people to continue to make the kind of choices that they're making, which are in fact causing the very crisis that's going to destroy the lives of you and your children. So that's the story for today. Okay? Thank you. Thank you for coming. And have a good Thanksgiving. There'll be no...